Hello there friends and welcome. For today's Elden Ring guide we have everything about the new best sorceries in the game, as patch 1.13 just hit and buffed and nerfed a lot of spells. And I'll also cover each best sorcery for a different category like close range and long range by comparing them all against Consort Radahn, the ultimate boss of the game. After all, if it works against him, it's gonna work against anything else. So let's just dive right into it. And well, we do have to begin with the big nerf to Impenetrable Thorns. This used to be the ultimate spell in the game for extreme amounts of damage super fast. As a matter of fact, you could easily hit for higher than 10,000, 14,000 even worth of damage with just one cast, as it would also quickly bleed enemies for huge chunks of damage. Now I'm afraid it is but a shadow of its former self, as not only has the damage been reduced by even less than half what it was before, it also barely procs bleed anymore, so it's gonna take a very long time. Hell, even its poise damage has been nerfed, so won't stance break bosses as easily. It did however receive a very minor buff of better enemy tracking, but let's be honest, that doesn't really matter. Anyways, it's not that I think the spell is worthless now. It does feel balanced, I suppose. You can hit enemies for higher than 5,000, 7,000 worth of damage per cast even if you really stack all sorts of damage modifiers. But here's the thing, this has always been great as a point-blank type of spell, so you cast it at melee range to quickly explode enemies. With the huge nerf to damage, I just don't see much of a point in casting it, unless for roleplaying, as opposed to the much better Zamor Ice Storm, which now reigns supreme as the best point-blank melee range spell in the whole game, as it not only hits a wide area of effect around your character so you can hit enemies that move around or move away from you, it also inflicts frostbite extremely fast for not only a big chunk of damage taken like bleed, but even debuffing the enemy's magical damage resistance, so they will take further damage from subsequent Ice Storm casts. And as if all that was not enough, it constantly deals damage to enemies as they stand inside the cloud, which also means amazing life stealing with, for example, Malenia's Rune. I mean, just look at us face tanking Radahn here like a boss, with even up to 30,000 continuous damage. That's how good Zamor Ice Storm is. So I'm afraid it's rest in peace for Impenetrable Thorns, as it's quite outclassed now. Second, we have a buff to one of my favorite new spells, Rings of Spectral Light, which just got both a damage upgrade and also increased frostbite build up. Rings of Spectral Light is great for multiple reasons and definitely one of your new best sorceries for both long and close range. When you cast it, you'll conjure a lot of Rings of Light that quickly combine and go flying towards the enemies. First, it has amazing range. It is one of the longest range spells in the whole game, to the point where it's only truly outclassed by the sniping spell, so Loretta's Great Bow and Loretta's Mastery. Second, enemies have a very hard time dodging this, unlike some of the other missile spells like Glintstone Shard. Third, the damage itself is very good and well, was just buffed now. And of course, Frostbite is just icing on the cake. As I just explained with Zamor Ice Storm, is one of the best debuffs in the game. Last but not least, it can also excel at point-blank range, because if you cast it close enough to enemies, the rings will all explode right as you cast them, just like a shotgun. So great overall. Third, we have a buff to the Glintstone Nails spell, another DLC sorcery. I'll be blunt, it was a decent enough spell before and it's even better now. It works kinda like Rings of Spectral Light. You'll summon a lot of projectiles that quickly unite and rush towards the enemy. The main issue I have with this spell is that even when buffed, it is just simply outclassed by the Rings of Spectral Light we just covered. For starters, it doesn't have as long a range. Second, it cannot inflict frostbite, so my question is why use this when you can just go for Rings of Spectral Light? I suppose it does deal higher stance damage, but it doesn't matter. But for normal enemies, they'll just be dead through Spectral Light alone. Besides that, we have a buff to the Vortex of Putrescence spell, as it now deals higher damage, the same for higher frostbite build up. Kinda like Spectral Light. I just don't particularly think it's a worthwhile spell. especially because it does cost 2 slots to activate. Basically, when you cast this, you'll conjure a huge cloud of Putrescence that you throw at the enemies and it then explodes for a decent enough area of effect. My main issue is, first, it doesn't hit enemies multiple times, which is very disappointing, and the damage itself is also quite subpar. However, I will admit that it can be good against enemy packs during normal exploration, but bosses, you have much better options. Glintblade Trio is another spell that was just buffed by patch 1.13. Now it will deal higher damage, and can even be cast under motion. This sorcery can deal decent enough damage. The main issue I have with this is, once again, it's outclassed by a much better spell, which is our best medium range spell, although it can also work for close range, Night Comet. It deals extreme damage, especially if you charge it while, let's say, dual wielding Staffs of Loss for the maximum damage boost possible to any spell school in this game. And well, you know, it's just faster, enemies have a harder time dodging it, and it's at the base game, so much better. Lastly, for another spell buff, as far as patch 1.13, we have Blades of Stone, which now deals increased damage, has faster casting speed, also hits a longer range. I'll be blunt, this spell is still very disappointing. For starters, the range is awful, you can miss enemies when cast at point blank even, and the damage is very subpar, I don't know what else to say. Especially because it's physical damage, which means it won't get as high damage bonuses as magical damage through, for example, the classic Terra Magica and also the Magic Shrouding Cracked Tier for your Flask. I suppose we still have one nerf to cover, which is to the Miriam's Vanishing Sorcery, as it now has a decreased invulnerability window against other players' attacks. It's honestly just a nerf for PvP, and to be fair, I would still much rather just use Endure for normal enemies and bosses, cause at least you are always guaranteed not being staggered and taking reduced damage. But Miriam's Vanishing still has its uses if you want. Now, we've already covered what all of the patch 1.13 sorcery nerfs and buffs are, but we might as well go for the other amazing spells in the game, for the remaining categories like buffs, debuffs, and so on. We already covered Point Blank, Area of Effect, which is Zamor Ice Storm, medium range, which is Night Comet, but it also works for short range, and long range for Rings of Spectral Light, but it's also very versatile. For the other spells, I do already have a best intelligence caster guide, you can check here where I cover them in depth, but to keep it simple, for buffing purposes, Terra Magica is still the must-have to increase all of your magical damage, but of course it won't work with physical damage spells like Blades of Stone, all of the gravity ones to be fair. Second, it's very easy to pre-buff with this before a boss battle by just casting it close to the boss's fog wall. This way, once you enter the arena, the siege will still persist and you'll be right on top of it as soon as battle starts. But even during battle, depending on the boss, like even Consort Radahn during his second phase start, you can also buff with this again, as you can see here. And the Endure Ash of War is always godly for that. Meanwhile, for debuffing, Ranni's Dark Moon is still the ultimate spell, as it not only deals a good amount of damage, can inflict Frostbite, but most importantly, will debuff the boss's magical damage resistance, so they'll take further damage from all of your magic-based spells. And fun fact, Ranni's Dark Moon can actually be used to deflect enemy projectiles, such as Radahn's Meteors, as you can see here. So even against the very final boss of the game, it will still have its uses. Not to mention all the bosses where you can get multiple casts off as soon as battle starts, like Malenia. Lastly, we have the Shard Spiral Sorcery, your best tool against the big fat white bosses like dragons. This spell is unique in that the Shard Spiral will keep on penetrating the enemy's body the bigger they are. So for example, against Bale the Dragon, a boss where Zamor Ice Storm wouldn't be as good because he keeps jumping all over half the map, that's where Shard Spiral shines. Now, I've already mentioned it before, but you also have some other great, let's say, early game spells like Glintstone Arc for dealing with enemy packs, as the arc will penetrate through multiple enemies and is very wide, and even the classic Rock Sling, one of the ultimate medium range spells for the early game. It's just heavily outclassed by, let's say, Night Comet or all the other DLC spells we mentioned. As far as the Carrion melee sword sorceries, I'm not covering them now because I'm saving them for my spell sword guide, which I'll be releasing very soon. And well, alright friends, so this was it for our new best sorceries in the game, all according and fully up to date to patch 1.13. If you found this guide useful as always, please remember to like, subscribe, and also consider becoming a channel member if you can. I highly appreciate your support. Thank you for watching and see you next time, friends.